Adolf Hitler is easily one of the most recognized names from history and has come to mean almost a crazy ruler that causes its country to do crazy and evil things. But what I want to do in this video is kind of understand how he got to where he was, or at least begin to understand how he got to where he was. So just to start at the beginning, he was born in 1889, and he's actually Austrian by birth. Austrians are Germans ethnically, and they speak the German language, but they were not part of the German Empire. But at the break of World War I, so this would be in 1914, he volunteers for the Bavarian army. So at this point, he's 25 years old. Bavaria was part of the German Empire. And over the course of World War I is, by most accounts, where Hitler first kind of found meaning in life. He was a dispatch runner, which means taking messages from one theater of war to another, from one military officer to another. He gets quite decorated. He gets wounded in battle. And at the end of the war, which him and frankly a lot of the military leadership of Germany blame on being on kind of the traitors of the civilian traitors, as we remember, as we kind of enter into late 1918 in October, you have the revolution in Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II is overthrown by civilian leaders. And then in November, you have the armistice. And Hitler and many of he was a fairly low-level figure in the German army at this time, but even many of the very senior figures, and we'll talk more about them, like Ludendorff and others, they blamed Germany's defeat not on just losing militarily to the Allied powers. They blamed it on kind of the stab in the back theory, that after the revolution, the civilians who signed this armistice, they didn't have to, that they were being controlled by outside influences. And they would also start to point at the Jews in Germany and saying that they were being somehow influenced by people outside of the country to try to get into an armistice. And they had this delusion that Germany would have won the war if this November armistice would not have actually been signed. And they call these civilians who signed the armistice, they call them the November criminals. November criminals for betraying the German nation. So you could imagine after the end of the war, he found so much meaning in the military that Hitler stays in the military. And just to get a big picture of what happens, we already know you have your October Revolution. Germany becomes a republic. They start drafting a constitution. At the same time, they start getting in the Allied powers in Versailles start dictating the terms of peace. In June, you have the Treaty of Versailles comes into effect. And we've already talked about this, but Germany loses a significant amount of its territory. It has to pay reparations now. And maybe most humiliating for the Germans, the full guilt of the war is placed on Germany's shoulders. Now, shortly after that, Hitler is an officer in the military. He is assigned to essentially spy, to infiltrate on the German Workers' Party, which is not a big deal at the moment. This is a party that has around 50 members. So he's just been given the responsibility, hey, keep track of what these characters are doing. Shortly after that, you have the Weimar Constitution gets written and passed. And the whole reason why it's called the Weimar Constitution is that it was drafted in the town of Weimar. And this is the constitution now of the German Republic, which would be known as the Weimar Republic because it's based on the Weimar Constitution, which was drafted in the town of Weimar. And even though Hitler joined in 1919 as kind of to spy on these guys, he's actually quite impressed by the German Workers' Party, which is hugely nationalist, which is it's in line with this whole blaming World War I's loss on these November criminals, these civilian leaders who betrayed the German army. It's anti-Semitic, it's anti-Jewish, it's anti-communist, and it's anti-capitalist. And it's interesting here because a lot of times when people talk about people like Nazis and fascists, they often talk about them as these far-right parties. But when people talk about left and right, they're usually talking in economic terms. So when you talk about someone on the left, you're talking about usually someone, the extreme left, you're talking about a communist, someone who believes in no classes, that there shouldn't be a rich and a poor, that maybe not even any private property. And if you talk about someone at the far right, so this is the left, and if you talk about someone at the far right, you're usually talking about someone who believes in kind of free market economics, who's a capitalist in the extreme. And The nationalist philosophy, and as we'll see, the fascist philosophy coming out of Italy, and the Nazi philosophy that would come out, that the Nazis essentially are what the German Workers' Party would evolve into, it was different than either one of these. This was actually all about your nationality, and in particular, from their point of view, their race as being a stronger race, as the government being a strong government that's all about the promotion of that race, all about the expansion of that state which is based on its race's power, about the purity of the race. So to a large degree, they were against a lot of these kind of these extreme forms of either left-wing Marxist communist philosophies or even pure capitalism. But anyway, he joins as the 55th member. So as you see at this point in time, it's not really a significant organization. And then in 1920, in order to have more appeal, especially on the nationalist side of things, they renamed themselves. Instead of just being the German Workers' Party, and the acronym is DAP, because when I call it German Workers' Party, I'm just saying what the translation would be in English. But then in 1920, they changed their name to the Nationalist Socialist German Workers' Party, or the NSDAP. And the word Nazi comes from nationalist, the way it was pronounced, and I'm sure I'm going to do it wrong, National. So you can imagine the National, if you just say the first part, you would pronounce it as Nazi. And early on, even in 1919 and especially in 1920, Hitler gets recognized by the party leadership as someone with very, very powerful oratorical abilities. Every time he makes an argument, he gives a speech, it seems like people are listening. And so he gets more and more pull and sway in the party. He actually is the individual who designed the logo for the Nazi party, put this swastika right over here. And the swastika is really an interesting symbol. We now associate, it's almost a scary symbol for those of us in the West, because it represents all of what the Nazi party ended up representing. But it's actually an ancient symbol that comes out of Hindu traditions. It comes out of kind of traditions out of the Aryan traditions. And this whole myth that Hitler constructed was about this Aryan race, which was the superior race, which was the cause of everything, all of the advancement that civilization has ever done. He was, and he considered the Germans as kind of the pure version of the Aryan race. He was a little bit confused. The Aryans are much more aligned. Persians are much more indicative of Aryans and even Indians. But the swastika was a symbol of auspiciousness, of good luck for the Aryans. And if you go to a Hindu temple, you might see a swastika. It does not mean what you think it means. It means actually something very positive. But Hitler adopted it. He actually wanted it to replace the cross, because to him, it represented not a belief system. It represented a bloodline. It represented an ethnic tradition that he thought he viewed the Germans as being the purest versions of. So it's a very fascinating symbol. And don't get scared if you see this used by Hindus or some other tradition. They don't mean it in the Nazi sense. But regardless, Hitler gets more and more power. By 1921, he's recognized as essentially the most influential member. When he threatens to quit because of kind of divisions happening in the party, they recognize that the party would be lost without him, because he's such a powerful speaker. And so they make him chairman. So at this point, 1921, you have Hitler as chairman of the Nazi party. And as time goes on, he's giving more and more speeches. He's able to attract more and more people to the party, although it's still a very small party. We're talking in the hundreds of members and now the thousands of members. And while this was happening in the early 20s, the conditions in Germany itself continued to deteriorate. Weimar Germany in particular is deteriorating economically. As we've already talked about, the Treaty of Versailles, they're having to ship resources to the Allies in order to pay reparations. The Weimar Republic is essentially just printing money, converting it into other currency, and then paying the reparations with that other currency. And it's one of the most famous examples of just hyperinflation. This is the value of one gold mark in paper marks. So the paper marks was the currency of the Weimar Republic. And you could see that as you go, especially from around 1919 and 1920 to 1922 and 1923, it was devalued not by a million, not even by a thousandfold, a millionfold, or a billionfold. It was devalued by nearly a trillionfold. So the paper was just becoming worthless. This was causing huge instability in the economy. And you have multiple attempts at overthrowing the government. Hitler wasn't the first. Multiple putsches, and I know I'm mispronouncing it, were attempted. Putsch is the German word for coup d'etat. And so as you get into 1923, Hitler himself feels emboldened. Multiple attempts were made. In 1922, you have Mussolini does the March on Rome. The fascists come to power. So he sees that as an example. So let me write that down, and we'll do another video on that. March on Rome. So then in 1923, Hitler is actually able to get some support of some pretty notable people, especially this gentleman right over here, Erich Ludendorff. Ludendorff was one of the two gentlemen who was in charge of the German military during World War I, but he was also one of these believers in the stab in the back theory, that they would have won the war if the civilians, who were apparently, according to him, controlled by the Jews, didn't surrender, that Germany would have somehow magically have won the war. He's able to get Ludendorff's support, and he attempts to essentially overthrow the government, first of Bavaria, and then take over the German government. So he attempts this, what's known as the Beer Hall Putsch, or the Beer Hall coup d'etat, in 1923 in a Munich beer hall. I actually visited it about 10 or 12 years ago. It's an interesting visit. It usually is on the tourist map when you go to Munich. And it's a failure. He had Ludendorff's support, but it's a failure. They try to march on the next morning after the failed beer hall putsch, and a bunch of Nazis are actually shot and then arrested, including Adolf Hitler. And so by 1924, he is thrown in prison. And while he's in prison is when he dictates his beliefs and his autobiography in Mein Kampf, which is translated as My Struggle. And it's an interesting document to look at. It's actually banned in some countries, and not in the U.S., and it's available on the web. Because when you look at it, it's really, you could kind of see how Hitler at one level was an amazing communicator, but on another level was essentially a troubled mind, a very demented mind, and who had a very skewed belief system. But this passage right over here is one of many in the book that kind of encapsulates his views of the world. If we pass all the causes of the German collapse in review, the ultimate and most decisive remains the failure to recognize the racial problem, and especially the Jewish menace. So he's seeing this lack of racial purity, and somehow the Jews are keeping the Germans from winning wars. The defeats on the battlefield in August 1918 would have been child's play to bear. They stood in no proportion to the victories of our people. It was not they that caused our downfall. No, it was brought about by that power which prepared these defeats by systematically over many decades robbing our people of the political and moral instincts and forces which alone make nations capable and hence worthy of existence. In heedlessly ignoring the question of the preservation of the racial foundations of our nation, the old Reich disregarded the sole right which gives life in this world. And if you read a lot of it, all he talks about is the reason why Germany lost this war, the reason why Germany was in the position that it's in after World War I, this humiliating position, isn't because it didn't have the most powerful military, isn't because the Germans aren't the most powerful race in the history of humanity, the purest descendants of the Aryan people. It's because they weren't pure enough. It's because they allowed themselves to somehow be muddied racially. And so it's this huge mythology that he constructs. It starts with the assumptions that the Germans, left to their own devices, would not have left this war, and he obviously starts to blame it on other causes, including somehow not being racially pure.